When I was an undergraduate, I took my first Asian American history class, and I realized, wow, there's all of these stories and all of these events and people that I didn't learn about when I was in high school. And so when I went into graduate school, I decided that I wanted to write a bookshelf full of stories that had never been told before. And so for me, history is really about recovering these stories that are hidden in field research, going out and doing interviews with people, going out and looking at archives and trying to piece together stories that haven't traditionally been told. And when we think about U.S. history, we often think about just continental U.S. history. And I think it's really important for us to understand that ever since the beginning of the founding of this nation, that we actually have a history of going beyond our borders and implementing certain kinds of policies in new spaces and places. And we often think, if we think about territories of the U.S., we can think about Hawaii or the ways we expanded across the continental United States, but we still have U.S. territories today, such as American Sāmoa. I went to American Sāmoa in the summer of 2014, hoping to find the relationship between Filipino and Tongan and Western Samoan cannery workers with the local indigenous people. But because one cannery closed in 2009 and the second cannery really reduced the number of workers available, the immigrants that I thought I could interview and figure out the history of their relationship were no longer there. They were actually gone. And so by the time I got there, and after the first few days, I realized that I needed to revise my topic, revise my research process and plan altogether. And so I ended up talking to as many leaders in American Sāmoa to try to find out what they felt were the most important keystone moments in terms of relationship with the U.S. federal government and the United States. And so therefore now my new project is looking at social and economic development programs that have impacted things like education, human trafficking laws, as well as the development of fisheries in the area. People think that the work that we do is something that's in the past, it's something that is an interesting story but has no relationship to the current day in the current world. And I think what's important about my project and the other projects that we've seen coming out of the Humanities Institute is really the ways in which today's world is really shaped by the historical processes that have been established in the case of American Sāmoa at the turn of the 20th century. And so if we look at the ways in which the United States has subsidized the tuna industry in American Sāmoa, we see that by the time we get to the 2000s, American Sāmoa is canning 80% of the world's tuna, right? This is a very current issue. This is something that people interact with on a daily basis. And now that these canneries are leaving, that has this huge impact on the people in these regions. And moving forward in terms of a humanities perspective, what we can do is use the history to understand what have been successful programs in terms of interactions between the U.S. federal government and American Sāmoa to help relationships moving forward. So American Sāmoa is actually a really quite interesting and unique situation because they are Pacific Islanders who are really based in oral tradition. And so typically when I've done research in the past on other U.S. colonials, people who have come under U.S. authority, there have been a lot of archives, written archives in Washington, D.C. or on the plantations that I've studied. But in American Sāmoa, because they have an oral tradition, many of the stories and the histories are actually not documented. And so it's really important for me to go out into the field, to meet with these communities, and to really piece together the history of the U.S. relationship with American Samoans. Without WIHR funding, I would not have been able to figure out that the immigrants that I thought I was going to study didn't live in American Samoa anymore. I actually often have my students in my classes, such as a comparative U.S. colonialisms class, think about if you were in Congress, if you were a policymaker, how, now that you understand the history of of these people and the ways in which the U.S. has interacted with these people, how would you solve this problem? So, for instance, American Samoans, it's an unincorporated territory. The people who are born and raised there have the option to become U.S. citizens, but they don't automatically become U.S. citizens. They are in charge of their own immigration programs, but now the U.S. is starting to enforce minimum wage requirements, which is why those canneries were leaving American Sāmoa. And so to really provide the background for students to understand why are these situations existing in our world today, and what are ways in which they could potentially have an impact moving forward.